Okay, guys. This is for a push to test review. You got about 53 questions here, covering a time period leading up to the road to the Revolutionary War. Sorry, guys. This is just going to be an audio piece, so I apologize. I'll try to speak plainly enough for you to be able to take notes off of this. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about colonial resistance. I mean, you had groups such as Sons of Liberty. We talked about how they were sort of a terrorist organization and that they were resisting British tax agents and stuff like that. But really, when it comes to colonial resistance, the Sons of Liberty weren't what swung the tide. Without a doubt, it was the boycotts that the colonies partook in that hit Britain in its pocketbook, and they were the most effective way of colonial resistance by far, really. Now, by 1774, we had something called the First Continental Congress, which took place in Philadelphia. And, basically the colonies are finally meeting as a sign of unity. And they were talking to some of the things that they addressed at the First Continental Congress was political unions and defensive preparations for a possible war. Although they still don't want a war, they don't expect a war. They're hoping to be prepared in case a war finds them. And obviously, it's a good thing they were. Now, also right around the same time period, you have writers such as Thomas Paine, who's putting out his famous Common Sense, where he writes in everyday terms, layman's terms, and he's speaking of independence and creating a republic. He is all on board for getting rid of Britain and creating something new and different, a republic. Basically the ideals of the Enlightenment, if you will. Now, Britain versus America, it seems like a pretty one-sided affair, pretty lopsided thing here. Britain enjoys many advantages over America. They have a much larger population. They have the most powerful navy in the world. They have incredible wealth that they can draw from if they need it. And they have experienced officers. Britain has been fighting in the French Indian War and the war against France. So they have a lot of experience. Really, the only advantages that America enjoys is that their military is more motivated because they're fighting for what they see as independence, fighting for their homes. Now, they are fighting a defensive battle, so they get some of the home turf advantages there. But really, on paper, it's David versus Goliath, without a doubt. Now, in the first 2 years of the war, Britain really tries to bluff the colonies into surrender. They don't want to. They're not fully committed to smashing the colonies. They want this thing done. They want the colonies to learn their lesson, and they want to go back to the relationship. So in the beginning, they really lose some advantages. If they wanted to come in and smash this, they probably could have, but that wasn't the angle that they were going after. And now Lexington Concourse, of course, starts the war, but the most important battle of the war, the turning point of the war, is Saratoga. And Saratoga proves to the French that the colonists have an opportunity, they have a chance to actually win this war, and it's going to ensure the Franco-American alliance. So you got to make sure you know that. Very important. Women in the war, their role is mostly domestic. They are behind the scenes, if you will. They're creating things like homespun cloth to help with the economic boycotts, their famous bark tea and whatnot. So they're the backbone of the revolution for sure, but they just don't have a public stance here, really. Now, to pay for this war, which is obviously going to be very expensive, wars tend to be, the colonists don't have really any other way except for printing paper money. And that's not going to be very good because it's going to lead to a lot of inflation, and it's going to cause some problems after the war. But paper money is the route that they take. With going back just a little bit, that's colonial stuff there, but we should know that the French Revolution resulted in the end of salutary neglect in America, which gave rise to Pontiac's uprising. The British provided better policies towards Indians because of Pontiac's uprising. It scared them enough that they're going to treat them a little bit better. The British troops would end up coming to America following the War for Empire, following the French Indian War. And really, they were sent there for a variety of reasons. Some of those to prevent future Indian uprisings. They want a presence there. They also want to enforce the Proclamation of 1763, which was trying to tell the colonists they couldn't settle west of the Appalachians. That wasn't going very well. They also wanted to keep colonists from rebellion. Colonists are getting a little uppity now that salutary neglect has ended, and they want to make sure that it doesn't go further than that. It's also because we get Canada in as a result of the French Indian War. They want to make sure that there's no rebellion by the French colonists there in Canada, that they accept that they now belong to Britain. Now, that's an expensive war. French Indian War is very expensive, and it's going to lead, as you know, to many intolerable acts as far as Americans saw it. Some of them starting with the Sugar Act. Colonists are resisting this growing administrative power of Britain. They've been used to running things themselves. They have a constitutional argument that Americans should be tried in British courts. They are very unhappy with the Sugar Act, where their smugglers are being processed in vice admiralty courts rather than American courts or colonial courts. But of course, Sugar Act's not going to be the last they see. They also get the Stamp Act. England's trying to tighten its control. They want to be more centralized. They want to have a larger footprint in the colonies, and the colonies resist this, as you know. And eventually we'll get into the Townshend Acts, which really scares the colonists because the royal officials were now going to be paid by British coin rather than colonial coin. They used to have a little bit of leverage because they were signing the checks for these officials, but now Britain's going to be footing the bill, and they're not going to have any leverage. The Townshend Acts would end up getting repealed, but they're going to leave the tax on the tea, kind of as teach them a lesson for the protests that they had. But we know that's going to lead to some important events down the line, such as the Boston Tea Party. Now, Valley Forge, getting back to the war. Valley Forge wasn't a battle, but it was an important thing. Washington's winter camp between 1777 and 1778. Loyalty to Washington is the only thing that keeps the Continental Army together. Smallpox starts up, and Washington, does his thing where he helps vaccinate them by a trick he had learned from some of his slaves. But really, loyalty to Washington's the only thing that keeps the army together. It's immensely important because if his army had drifted away during that winter, we certainly wouldn't have won the Revolutionary War, and we owe it to his charisma there. Now, the Franco-American alliance on the surface looked very unlikely. You had Catholic-dominated France versus Protestant-dominated America. You had a monarchy versus this new idea of a republic. We had fought against each other in the past when we were British subjects. So on the surface, it doesn't seem likely, but yet, as you know, it's still going to happen. Now, Britain, when it came to the Revolutionary War, Britain wanted to use loyalists in their southern campaign. There's more loyalists in the South, especially in the beginning, and they're hoping to use them to help administer their territories in the South. They think that they're going to get a lot of support in the South, much more than what they end up getting. But that's not going to happen, and eventually we'll make it to Yorktown, and Yorktown is going to be the final battle of the Revolutionary War. And, there were some reasons why Washington was a successful general in this war. He always maintained support of Continental Congress. They always supported him, even when he lost. State governments supported Washington and the Continental Army. They were willing to do whatever they could to help out there. And he has an it factor. People didn't want to let down George Washington. So, these are all important things that led to him being a very successful general, even when he lost, several battles. Now, the Treaty of Paris is going to be the official end, 1783, of the Revolutionary War. And some of the results of the Treaty of Paris, Britain gives up its land all the way to the Mississippi River. They also gave Americans fishing rights off of Newfoundland, there off of Canada. They also, of course, recognized the independence of the 13 colonies. That was something they had to do. In return, they were hoping that they pushed for confiscated property from the loyalists to be returned to the loyalists, but a lot of that isn't going to happen. You had some 100,000 loyalists who actually left the colonies to go to Canada so that they would not be out of the British empire, and a lot of them lost property in all this. Now, our first government, of course, was the Articles of Confederation. It's not a very good government. We're too fearful of centralized power. In it, Congress had no power to tax the individual states. They've got to ask for it, and that's not going to go very well. The states are simply too powerful for this to work. And it only had one branch of government, which was, of course, Congress. So that was also a weakness in many ways. Now, eventually we realized that we've got to replace this government and get something better. So we start looking for a constitution, but we got a problem. We're fighting over, big states and small states can't get together on this. Who's going to have more influence? Eventually, Henry Clay gives us the Great Compromise. We get the Virginia versus New Jersey plan, a unicameral House, one House Senate based off of population. That's a big state plan. The little states don't like it. What we're going to get out of the Great Compromise, though, is a bicameral House where you get the Senate is based off of one. In this time period, it was one vote per state. But then you also got a House of Representatives that went off of population. So it was a compromise between the big and the small states plan. Now, without a doubt, the Constitution never gets ratified if we don't get the Bill of Rights. It was the key piece. It protected things like speech and religion and the freedom to assemble and things. And Federalists are a little bit, anti-Federalists are a little freaked out. And so this will help ease their fears. It makes the Constitution a very legitimate document and really help balance state and federal power for this new government. Whereas the Articles of Confederation, states had too much power for sure. Now, in New America, Hamilton is the guy that rigs up our new financial system. Very, very important. He puts forth the BUS, the Bank of the United States, a national bank. He says that we got to pay off the Confederation securities at their face value, basically our allegiances while we were colonies. He also puts forth excise taxes. He wants tariffs. Of course, these things are going to lead to the Whiskey Rebellion later on. He wants to assume state war debts. He feels like the national debt the national government needs to pick up on that. And as a compromise to get this, he is going to give the Southerners a capital. The capital will be taken out of Philadelphia, New York, where it had been, and it's going to be in a new place, a brand new place called Washington, D.C., of course. Now, eventually, we'll get Thomas Jefferson as the president, and Jefferson had this very agrarian vision of America. He envisioned us as a nation of yeoman farmers, and he's a farmer himself, albeit a rich one. In 1795, we get Jay's Treaty, and in that, it's going to boot the British out of the Northwest Territory, where they had been able to hang on to their forts after the Revolutionary War. And it's going to force the British to give no more aid to the Indians. The British have been stirring up problems out there with the Indians. Now, the question order is a little out, so let me backtrack just a little bit to John Adams, our second president. He was very sensitive. He was a Federalist, and he's most known for his, the bad idea that was the Naturalization, Alien, and Sedition Acts. Basically, which meant you could not publish insults or malicious attacks against Congress or the president. Didn't go over very well. Probably a big reason that he was only a one-term president. Now, after him, of course, we get another election, and that's the Revolution of 1800, as Thomas Jefferson called it. And he called it that because it was an orderly transfer of government from John Adams to Jefferson, two different political parties. Now, Jefferson has to deal with the Midnight Judges, these bunch of Federalists who were obviously against him and his ideas. But this does lead to a very important court case called Marbury versus Madison, where the Supreme Court could rule that laws were unconstitutional. That's a very important power of the newly minted judiciary branch. Now, Jefferson himself was a strict constructionist of the Constitution, but he would not remain that way the entire time. He would eventually switch over to a loose interpretation. Mostly this was so that he could buy the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon in France. It was just too good of a deal to pass up. Once he bought it, he sent Lewis and Clark on this scientific journey. mostly because we needed to explore new territory. But Jefferson's a scientist, and he's interested about new animals and new plant life and things like that. He wants to know what's out there. Now, Jefferson's second term does not go as good as his first. He's notoriously known for his embargo of 1807. He's trying to deal with the French and the British. Basically, he says that he won't trade with either. That hurts our economy very, very badly, and it could have led to countries aren't going to buy American products, so it's going to be hard for us to make money. And right after this, soon after this, we would get the War of 1812 with James Madison as president, and we pretty much get our booties kicked. Our best battle happens with Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. Now, what's important about that is at least it restores national pride. It's kind of embarrassing there for a while, getting the White House burned and all that, but we ended on a decent note, I guess. You get John Marshall as the first Supreme Court justice. So it's his court was known as the Marshall Court. He upheld the national supremacies of law. He was very powerful. That national laws are supreme over state law. He saw judicial review in the Marbury versus Madison case. Basically, that the Supreme Court can rule a law unconstitutional. The bus wouldn't be renewed, the Bank of the United States, but 5 years after it, they would end up chartering the second Bank of the United States. The Panic of 1819 follows up, and it was caused by a drop in world agricultural prices. And I will actually have to pause right here. I've run out of time, but I will give you a part 2. Thank you very much for listening. Okay, I think I'm back. Hopefully I did that right. Okay, between the 1780s and 1820, what you see in America is the formation of a market revolution. We have a national market, very important. We're not as self-sufficient on the farms anymore. We're going to market to buy our goods. You get a large rural workforce. All these people out on the farm, so you have plenty of people, and you mobilize them. Very important there. Resulted in more trees being cut down. You see an environmental aspect to it. The farms become very dependent on the market, and families are working harder than their ancestors had to because of this market revolution. But the market revolution is going to lead to something called the transportation revolution. You're going to get a canal boom with the Erie Canal, and you're going to get national roads being built. Eventually, you'll even get railroads because of the market revolution. And you really get the idea that by working hard, you can move yourself up the social ladder, that you can advance in society. Also in this time period, you see that parents lose their influence on children's marriages. They don't have enough property holdings to have leverage, which helps lead to the age of sentimentalism, basically where people are marrying for love rather than marrying who their parents want them to marry, which is good because it leads to happier marriages, as you can imagine. It also, in this time period, a big aspect is the Republican motherhood, and that's the idea that women were uniquely qualified to educate and nurture the spirits of the children of our republic, of our America. It's also a way to kind of shackle them into the home and keep them out of public duties and public speaking. Education in this time period, farmers are not concerned with the formal education. They don't mind their younger children going to learn the 3 R's, the reading, writing, and arithmetic. But they're not enthused with the idea of high school in the time period because they want them working on the farm with them. You get the rise of Noah Webster in this time period. He is trying to basically conform the language of the colonies into one. So he's going to have a dictionary, of course, know him for Webster's Dictionary, and spelling books so that we can all spell the same way. Now, the South in this time period as a region is definitely aided by the fact that it's dominating the presidency with so many presidents coming from the South. It's also dominating the Senate as well. Our great compromiser, Henry Clay, is going to give us another compromise in this time period because slavery has reared its ugly head. And he's going to give us the Missouri Compromise, which basically says, above the Missouri line, any state that comes into the nation will be a free state. Below the Missouri Compromise line, anything that comes into the nation will be a slave state. So that sums up this Unit 2 review for your test. Difficult test, but I think with this review, you'll have a lot better chance of being successful on it. So I hope it works for you guys. Thanks.